Womanjiga, kia ora, welcome. Thanks for joining us today to help launch an important piece of cross-Tasman collaboration. Recovery Capital's resources are an important step forward in supporting wellbeing after disasters. My name's John Richardson. I'm the National Resilience Advisor with Australian Red Cross, and I'm delighted to be your host here today. Red Cross is a partner of AIDA, Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience, and we're really pleased not only to be part of this research, but also being able to bring it to you through the great work that AIDA does in translating research. I'd like to first start by acknowledging that I'm hosting this event from the lands of the Bunurong people in the Kulin Nation, and also acknowledge traditional custodians of the various lands in which you all join us today, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are participating in this event. And pay my respects also to elders past, present, emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and the waters across Australia. I also want to recognise and respect the knowledge and wisdom that comes with 60,000 years of living with extremes of earth, sky and water. And not only that, but dispossession, disease and loss of connection to country. There's certainly much that we can learn. I'd now like to ask Emily to give us a mihi in recognition of those who are joining us from across the ditch today.
Thanks, John. Ahi ahi Māori, e tēnei ropu, no mai haere mai i ngā tangata whenua katoa, no mai haere mai i ngā ringaropa o recap, haere mai ki te kōrero me te whakawhitiwhiti whakāroa, Māori mai o Pukinga, ko te whakatauki he waka i te noa, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So, in Te Reo Māori, which is the Indigenous language of Aotearoa, I've just acknowledged the Indigenous peoples across all of our nations, as well as all of you that have joined us for this session today to listen, discuss and share.
Thank you, Emily. Wonderful to hear in language. So before we get on to the exciting stuff, it's the boring stuff. And I just want us to talk a little bit about housekeeping. You can see that's all up there. Really the kind of key thing is that we're going to record it and it'll be made available after the event, so you'll be able to share it amongst people you know or watch it later on, whatever you want to do. Make sure you use the Q&A function on Zoom to questions and not the chat window. We won't see the questions in chat. You may want to answer them amongst yourselves, but they certainly won't get to the panelists, so use Q&A. Feel free to upvote any of the questions, and I will do my best to kind of make sure we get these asked. Vote early, vote often, and have a discussion while this is going on. Use the chat window. That's what it's there for. It doesn't have to be static. It'd be great if you have a conversation about sort of what you're hearing. And of course, I guess the other thing is just to be really mindful of when you are having a chat. Let's be respectful to sort of each other. And when you're posting comments or questions. So getting okay, we've got the boring stuff out of the way. Let's get into it. Briefly, I guess just before I introduce the speakers, just a couple of sort of reflections on sort of the project. And this really represents a maturing of the disaster research agenda over the past 20 years, where we have sort of gone from prescribed burning and flood culverts to sort of really understanding and sort of focusing on social dimensions of disasters. The interesting thing for us to continue to recognise is that our experience in recovery is really complex, and evidence-based guidance is really, really critical. Because those of us that have been there managing after the disaster, there's often a real tension about doing what we think's right or what people feel might be right or they want to have happen and what the evidence sort of tells us to do. So having this sort of advice certainly can help guide us. Our recovery workforce, quite often we have to scale up really quickly. And a lot of people who've brought in with great skills and capacities in the jobs that they know, but the context is challenging, fast-paced and dynamic. So having this sort of resource is really helpful. But equally with that fast-paced, dynamic and challenging environment, the information needs to be accessible and engaging so that people can pick it up and run with it really quickly. And I think that's the last thing, and we will talk about this in a bit more detail, but this is really a great opportunity for us to sort of advance our conceptual frameworks of recovery. You know, nearly 20 years ago, we sort of started thinking about recovery in terms of sort of built, natural, economic and social environments. And by doing this work, we're sort of starting to see the advancement. So that's enough from me to sort of try and set a bit of a context for what you're about to see here and discuss next. And what I'd really love to do now is to welcome our first two speakers for today. These are the main drivers for getting this project to where it is, two supremely talented early career researchers. So Phoebe Quinn, who's a research fellow at University of Melbourne, and Emily Campbell, research officer at Massey, who you've already heard from. They're really going to take us through how we got to where we got to today. Over to you, Phoebe and Emily.
Thanks so much, John. Okay, so I wanted to first acknowledge that I'm speaking from Wurundjeri country, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge that this is unceded land. And I also wanted to say up front how central the contributions of Maori and First Nations peoples have been to this recap project, both in terms of the appropriateness of the resources to Indigenous peoples in each country, but also to the value of the resources in supporting all communities. And we'll touch on that a little bit throughout the session today. But really what we wanted to do today is first briefly outline the resources that we've produced through the Recovery Capitals or RECAP project. But then we want to focus on exploring the ways in which the resources have been already used and how they can be used in future. And we'd love for you all to have a bit of a think about how you might like to use them and any ways that we may be able to support you in that. So what was the Recovery Capitals project? The aim was to produce evidence-based resources to guide people who are involved in supporting disaster recovery. And we've got a short video to play now just to give you a bit of a flavour of the project.
Lessons from recovery tell us what would have been really good to have in place before the event. And so it helps us with preparedness and building what you could call a resilient community.
We all love a resource that's just there sitting ready for us. The RECAP resource that's been based on evidence is a trusted source of good information and a good way to structure things, do things, share information in the recovery efforts that's easy to use. So that's going to be really valuable.
It's really helpful to identify who has had a positive recovery, I guess, because we might learn from that to benefit others. And the nice thing about some of those aspects of what would make a difference is that they also are just really positive in everyday life. If you've got a community where there's lots of local involvement, that community is likely to fare better if something happens. So it's not like you're trying to invest money in something that in 20 years might be useful. It's like, well, let's do something that's great for now and will also protect us if something terrible happens.
Evidence base like this is really good to help with the decision making. There's some principles there that are guiding you through your decision making because there's no formula really. Every situation is going to be entirely different. It will be a really good resource to help people come up to speed, but also to give all of us confidence when we're starting to deliver a recovery program.
Okay, great. So we're presenting today on behalf of the whole RECAP team. So that includes Lisa Gibbs, who you saw in that video just then, also Alana Perrone, Dr. Denise Blake, Professor David Johnson, as well as some very talented artists, Oslo Davis, Frances Bell Parker, and Ariki, whose artwork has been incorporated into the resources. But really, the RECAP project was carried out by a much wider group of people, academics and practitioners across Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and further afield. And we're very fortunate to have 4 of those people on today's panel. So John will introduce those people shortly. But yeah, really it was just a very collaborative process across both countries, and practitioners played a very central role throughout the whole process. So who and what are the RECAP resources for? Well, in terms of who, our target audience was recovery workers, including experienced practitioners and people who are newer to this work. But we also defined recovery workers very broadly because we recognise that good recovery requires support from a whole range of people, including people like teachers, healthcare workers, businesses, community organisations, many others who may not necessarily identify as recovery workers, but the reality is that when a disaster, especially a major disaster, affects a community, that's what people become. And in terms of what the resources are for, as I said, that'll be the focus of today. But one point I just wanted to emphasise is that although the focus of the project was recovery, it's called Recovery Capitals, as Lisa was saying in the video, lessons from recovery are also really relevant for disaster preparedness and resilience more broadly, and also just community wellbeing. So the resources can really be used at any time, and we very much encourage you not to feel like you need to wait until after a disaster occurs to use the resources. So we'll touch on the whole set of resources a little bit later, but you can find them all at recoverycapitals.org.au. And for now, I just want to focus on the main resource, which is called the Guide to Disaster Recovery Capitals, or the RECAP Guide for short. So the intent with the RECAP Guide was to bring forward evidence so that people can make decisions for disaster recovery with some confidence about what makes a difference and what was known from research from previous disasters, and to really communicate that in the RECAP Guide in a clear and simple way. So here's an example of how we've done that for a particular topic. So this one sits within the natural capital section, but there's about 50 topics contained within the guide. So you can see that for each of them, we've got a statement of what we know based on academic evidence, and that's accompanied by points to consider. And we included those consider points because we heard from the practitioners who were involved in the project that it would be useful to provide a bit of a bridge between the evidence summaries and, okay, so what do we do in practice based on that? But we deliberately made sure that they're not prescriptive sort of recommendations, they're not specific instructions. Instead, they're prompts for recovery workers to reflect on what that information means in their particular context, and reflecting that sort of approach of being guided by the community as well. And as John was saying, recovery is really complex. So to help with structuring the RECAP Guide and navigating that complexity while still keeping the RECAP Guide easy to digest, we used the Recovery Capitals framework, which we based on an existing community capitals framework and refined throughout the project. I don't have time to go into detail on that today, but you can find information about it in the RECAP Guide itself, as well as in some reports that we have on the website. And, oh, sorry, I'm just seeing a comment about the slides. Oh, no, good. Yeah, so we have reports on the website, and we also have an upcoming academic paper that goes into it. But just to touch on some key points. So the Recovery Capitals framework identifies 7 capitals: natural, social, financial, cultural, political, built, and human. And we define capitals as resources that can be maintained, increased, and drawn upon to support wellbeing. So in the RECAP Guide, there is a section for each of those 7 capitals. And the Recovery Capitals framework supports strengths-based approaches to disaster recovery support by helping us to look at how these capitals that people and communities have can be drawn upon and further developed to support resilience and recovery. And it's also important, I wanted to note that our intent is for the recovery capitals approach to be used in a way that aligns with community-led recovery approaches. So it's not about using a capitals approach to make external assessments of the levels of capitals in a community and looking at deficits or making top-down assessments on that basis. Instead, what we envisage is for each person and community to be able to assess the strengths and resources that they already have and identify priorities for enhancing their capitals to support recovery based on what's important to them. The other thing that we've tried to do with the Recovery Capitals Framework and in the recap guide is to reflect the interconnectedness. So it's a really holistic approach to understanding how the capitals are deeply interrelated. And you can see on this slide that that's illustrated in this artwork by Frances Bell Parker. So instead of treating each of the 7 capitals as separate silos, they're really interacting elements to be addressed together. So in the recap guide, what we've done is, even though we have those 7 sections for the different capitals, for each topic, we've included icons linking them to the other capitals where relevant. And just coming back to what John was saying about the way recovery has been conceptualised in the sector in recent decades, we just put together this diagram just to show you, I'm sure many people will be familiar with the 4 environments framework. And this diagram just shows how the Recovery Capitals Framework links with that and extends on it. So it's very much compatible, but it's just a kind of an extension. So you can see that the social environment is expanded into 4 capitals. So social, cultural, political, and human. And the idea with that is to really highlight some of the important aspects of recovery that don't receive so much attention often because they're subsumed into that one social category. So to just summarise, sorry, not summarise, but to cap that off, the recap, Australian version of the recap guide is available online as a PDF, but it's also available as interactive web pages on the Phoenix Australia Disaster Mental Health Hub. We do also have some printed copies, which are available on request. So reach out to me if you're interested in that, although we only have a very small number left. But we can provide the digital file for printing if you would like to print extra. And now I'll throw to Emily to talk about the version of the recap guide that was adapted for Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Great, thanks Phoebe. Such a comprehensive overview. So yeah, I'll now talk about the creation of an Aotearoa version of the guide. And so this image depicts the front cover of our Aotearoa New Zealand edition. While the Massey University research team played a role in the creation of the Australian guide, we decided a version for each country could more genuinely speak to the unique relationships that our Indigenous cultures have within their own environment. So this separation also means that each version is able to articulate the cultural specificities of its nation. One key difference is language, for example, how people of each Indigenous culture care for and relate to the land. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, this is referred to as caring for country, and in Aotearoa Māori referred to this concept as kaitiakitanga, which has connotations of protection and guardianship. So further to this point, Māori, the Indigenous people of Aotearoa New Zealand, are regarded as tangata whenua, which essentially translates to people of the land and quite poignantly reflects this deep connection that they do share with the natural environment. Great. So this understanding needed to be conceptualised biculturally across all capitals in our version of the guide to respect the Māori worldview in parallel with more mainstream research. And this was made possible by drawing on the body of amazing research undergone in this space by Māori academics and researchers, which recognises unique Māori experiences and perspectives in relation to disaster response and recovery, including the importance of Māori history, knowledge of the land, and community-based social practices. For example, understanding that the deep relationship that Māori have with the land means that any natural hazard event may cause impact in a way that can be deeply wounding and distressing. And also recognising the intergenerational knowledge, experiences and cultural practices in supporting disaster preparedness, recovery, response and recovery. So this image on this page represents Papatūānuku, who is the Earth Mother, which in a Māori understanding of the universe is the embodiment of the natural environment. So on that point, following consultation with our stakeholders here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we quickly realised that we needed to produce a resource that embodied those concepts graphically as well. And this manifested in original artwork that supported the knowledges included. To do this, we collaborated with a Māori artist called Ariki, who is steeped in Māori history and customs, and we are so grateful for their ability to translate the ideas in the guide visually. For instance, financial on the left is represented as trade, which reflects early encounters and negotiations between Māori and settlers. And political is represented as debate, which is a key concept in Māori decision-making and also reflective of democratic processes. An additional aspect of being culturally accountable is through the commitment to the revitalisation of Te Reo Māori. So we're currently in the process of having this, the entire guide translated into Te Reo Māori, which, as I said earlier, is the Indigenous language of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Emily. So that was an incredible process to observe from our perspective, the Australian side of the recap team, and we learned a huge amount from observing that. And we also had the great privilege of working with Bhiamie Williamson, who's one of the panellists today, to for the Australian recap guide to embed attention to the experiences of First Nations peoples affected by disasters within the recap guide. And together with Bhiamie and other Aboriginal service providers that we consulted with, we created also a separate resource called Indigenous Peoples and Recovery Capitals, which really is a complement to the recap guide. And you can see a screenshot of that here, where it highlights some of the particular strengths of Indigenous peoples and communities with respect to those 7 capitals. As I mentioned, you can find the full set of recap resources at recoverycapitals.org.au. And we've already touched on several of them, but in addition, there's also a set of recovery stories, which are mostly in video format. There is a podcast series called After the Disaster, which was a collaboration between the ABC, University of Melbourne and Australian Red Cross. There's some background materials about the project. We've also made available some PowerPoint slides, including some of the ones that you've seen today. And the idea with that is just that if anyone is interested in presenting or talking within their networks about the recap approach or the resources, they're just available for you to just draw on if that's useful. And finally, we put together a set of activities with the idea that they can help with using the recap guide in practice in various scenarios. So I'll talk through a couple of examples in a minute, but broadly they can be used in pre-event recovery planning as well as in post-event recovery planning. They can be worked through independently or within a team of colleagues, or also potentially as a tool for engaging with a broader group of people. And as I mentioned earlier, we'd be very happy to work with anyone to support that in any way we can. So if you were interested, for example, in running some kind of workshop with your colleagues, and there's some way that we could be involved to support that, please just reach out to me. So on the next slide, we've got an example of one of the activities, or some questions from one of the activities that we put together. And we just wanted to run these 2 questions as a poll now. So to start with the first question, It's, do you see yourself as someone with a formal, informal or emerging role to play in supporting community recovery from a disaster? So if we could pop that poll up, can everyone see that? Great. So as you're answering that, it would be great if you could also reflect on why or why not you see yourself as having a role in recovery, and feel free to jot down your thoughts in the chat if you like. And we don't have time to sort of unpack that discussion in this session, but you can imagine, I think, how if you were running that kind of question with a group of, a broad group of people, it could be a way of initiating a conversation to build a broader understanding of the various roles that people have to play in recovery. So if I can't actually see the progress of the poll. Do we have enough to see the results yet? Okay, great. So that's probably not surprising that most of the people who've come along today do have a formal or an emerging role. Great, so if we move on to the next question, please. So which of the 7 recovery capitals do you see as most relevant to your current or potential role? This time I'd like to invite you to reflect on each of the other capitals as well and see if you can identify a way that each capital does actually relate to your role as well. So again, we don't have time to unpack it in this session, but you can imagine how in a workshop situation that could play out and potentially be drawing on the recap guide to help sort of prompt that reflection. Okay, great. So just to go over the, actually we better have a look at the results before I move on. Okay, great. So most people focusing on social or human capital. Great, that's really interesting. Okay, so on to the next slide, please. Just to give a sense of some of the other activities that are available, there are some that are designed to help with taking those consider prompts and actually translating them into sort of tangible action plans in your particular context. There's also an activity for drawing out evidence from the concise evidence summaries that are contained in the recap guide. So you're drawing them out if you have a situation where drawing on evidence summaries would be useful. For example, if you were putting together a pitch for funding and you wanted to be able to demonstrate the evidence base supporting what you were advocating for. And then there's also some activities for pre-event recovery planning and identifying steps. For example, who are the key contacts that you might need to develop relationships with to be able to sort of support recovery as outlined in the recap guide. Okay, great. That's all from me. I'll throw back over to you, John.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks, Phoebe, for taking us inside how we got to where we have got to today. So we're going to take it a bit further now, and I want to introduce the panel to you. Firstly, I want to introduce Bhiamie Williamson, who Phoebe has already mentioned as a research associate and PhD candidate at the ANU and has been really quite prominent in helping us as a sector sort of understand Indigenous perspectives of the post-Black Summer bushfires, but beyond that. Then I'd like to introduce Bronwyn Sparks, who's with the National Recovery and Resilience Agency as the Director of National Disaster Recovery Policy and Framework, and also has a really strong lived experience in disasters. And then I'd like to introduce Kirsten Jenkins, who's the Manager of Health, Local Laws, Emergency Management and Maroondah Council. Really strong backgrounds, also an experience in disasters, and will give us that local perspective. And finally, I would like to introduce Michael Donoghue, who's a Disaster Recovery Manager from New Zealand Red Cross, who will also give us the sort of civil society perspective. And we'll both Emily and Phoebe will join us for the panel discussion. So, firstly, I suppose, I guess, Brian, I'd like to ask you, given your role, you know, as a kind of national sort of policy driver person, could you tell us a bit about how you've been using these recap resources and what you sort of think is useful about the recap framework?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, John, and thank you everyone for having me today. To just provide you with a little bit of context in terms of how I work in the national space. Essentially, my role within the National Recovery and Resilience Agency is to support the two subcommittees that sit under the Australian-New Zealand Emergency Management Committee. And specifically today, I'm going to talk about one of the projects that we're really driving under one of those subcommittees, which is the Community Outcomes and Recovery Subcommittee, or otherwise known as CAWRS for short. CAWRS essentially consists of representatives from government agencies with emergency management, recovery and resilience responsibilities across all states and territories, the Commonwealth, New Zealand, and also includes the Australian Local Government Association. CAWRS essentially supports the NZC by informing national community outcomes and recovery policies and capabilities, and delivering outputs and projects that strengthen Australia and New Zealand's preparedness for and resilience to natural and human caused events, in particular those that have severe to catastrophic consequences. So going back a couple of years, in 2019, the CAWRS ran a recovery planning for catastrophic crisis workshop, which really identified the need for us to be able to better differentiate between disaster impacts, consequences, and recovery needs, because recovery needs and the consequences of disasters are quite different from the impact of that disaster. So to do this, CAWRS acknowledged the need to support a greater understanding of consequences arising from disaster impacts on communities, so that recovery programs that are developed can better address the recovery needs of those communities, and importantly, at different stages or points in time in the recovery process. As a result, the CAWRS and the NZC agreed to a project that focused on building that capability and understanding by developing recovery needs assessment guidelines. And these guidelines aim to provide high-level guidance for identifying recovery needs at the community level, and to provide advice on how and when to undertake recovery needs assessments, regardless of the type, scale, or location of the disaster event. And the guidelines draw on evidence-based recovery principles and resources, including ones that many of us are familiar with, the Community Recovery Handbook, the National Principles for Disaster Recovery, the National Monitoring and Evaluation Framework for Disaster Recovery Programs, and of course the RECAP Guide, which we're discussing today. So why did we choose to incorporate the RECAP Guide and its associated resources into the CAWRS guidelines that they're developing? Because essentially we recognise that recovery needs assessments and the consequences of disasters that are, because we recognise that recovery needs assessments should take into account the needs across the 4 recovery environments, so the social, built, economic, and natural, at different points in time, so that we can identify immediate and long-term recovery needs of communities. RECAP essentially provides us and the guides with a useful, tangible, and effective frame, which is evidence-based for anyone who may be involved in identifying a community's recovery needs and developing those community recovery programs. We also like the RECAP Guide as it does take a strengths-based approach to understanding communities and what they value, so that they can draw on these elements and prioritise them in their recovery journey. What is also particularly useful from our perspective is that RECAP expands on the 4 recovery environments, reflecting 7 recovery capitals, so social, cultural, political, human, built, economic, and natural. And it really highlights how all of these capitals are related and interconnected, and helps to guide us in terms of the things we need to consider when trying to understand and elicit the recovery needs of communities who have been impacted by disasters. So just to give you a bit of a tangible example, using the material loss of a bridge between two communities because of a natural hazard event, that's considered your disaster impact. The consequences of this impact for the community is far greater than just the physical loss of that infrastructure. The consequences can be broad-reaching across all of those other recovery capitals, because the loss of the bridge isolates communities and it can affect their social and cultural well-being, the health and well-being of individuals and households, and it can have economic and financial impacts on the community as well. Consequences are going to be specific to each community and what is of value to that community or what makes that community work. RECAP really highlights this in a way that encourages us to think about and consider those consequences, so we're in a better position to identify, address and respond to the community's specific recovery needs and prioritise the recovery of those things which are of value to the community and or enable their effective functioning. And I think the other thing is that while the recovery needs assessment guidelines and RECAP would primarily be used in a post-disaster context, we also recognise the value in using these same resources in a pre-disaster or recovery planning process, planning context. Because understanding the pre-disaster community context across those 7 recovery capitals enables a more comprehensive understanding of needs post-disaster and consequently provide a more effective recovery program based on not only the recovery needs of that community, but that community's strengths. And I might leave it at that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Bronwyn, and seeing the complexity of recovery policy at the national level, sort of being able to sort of, I guess, help unpack that is a great thing for this resource to be able to assist with. I'm going to cross the Tasman and ask Michael. I understand the Aotearoa version is relatively new, but are there any particular ways that you might be drawing upon the RECAP resources in the work that you're either doing now or potentially how you could see it being used in the future?
Yeah, well, there certainly is, John. And I think from my point of view as a practitioner, I think one of the real challenges is how do we take this kind of best practice, this kind of wealth of evidence, and actually put wheels on it and use it to transform the conversations that we're having with communities. I think that is one of the biggest challenges, because there's a wealth of information out there. There's so much work being done around what valuable lessons we've learned. And look, some of those lessons we've paid a really high price for. So when we take lessons that we've learned overseas, this is people's lives that have been affected. So taking those lessons and really valuing them and giving them a way to make them accessible to others is really, really important. And I can't think of a more important or a nobler cause than actually taking those lessons and really using them to benefit others at sometimes the most trying times in people's lives as well. So I guess for me, the RECAP guide is essentially about having a conversation around how do we frame recovery. And Bronwyn touched on this idea of us being needs driven. So one of the first things we do after a disaster is do a needs assessment, look and think, well, what are the needs of the community? And that can sometimes make us have a deficit mindset around communities and sometimes think of communities as something that's broken and that it's something that needs to be fixed. And there's much more than that. And we know there's much more than that to communities, but sometimes it's easy to get tangled up in that frame of mind. So the great thing, and one of the great things about the RECAP guide, and it's already been touched upon, is that it's strengths-based. So it takes 7 capitals and it allows us to really be beyond the visible and the tangible. And look, one example I can think, and I'm sure you've all heard of the earthquakes in Christchurch in 2010, 2011, it was really easy to see on the news the damage to the buildings, the damage to the roads, the damage to the infrastructure. What was more difficult to see was the damage to the social fabric, the damage to the neighbourhoods, where the neighbours had actually got up and left the city, and children were going to different schools, and friendship groups were lost, support networks that had been nurtured over sometimes many years were suddenly gone. They weren't there anymore. And so that's much harder to see. And I think from our point of view, if we're unable to provide a framework for people to draw upon some of the knowledge in this area, and that's a great thing. And look, one of the things it does draw on, and this is just one example, there's so much I could draw out from here, but one example is the work that Daniel Aldridge has done on social cohesion. And he talks about these vertical ties between the community and the power brokers, and the horizontal ties between the community as well, in this idea of social capital. And so we know that communities that have good social cohesion and strong social capital have better outcomes from a recovery point of view. And we know that communities that are involved and participate in the recovery have far better outcomes as well. But how do we put wheels on that? How do we actually take this best practice and actually communicate it to communities in a way that makes sense at a time that they're not able to absorb information? And the one thing I absolutely love about the recap guide is it's so digestible, and it's got these kind of bullet points that kind of breaks down things to consider when we're in recovery. And it's one sentence or it's one bullet point. So it's not someone having to trawl through, literature or very dense books around best practice. It's actually breaking it down into a format that is usable and making it accessible. So it's about making best practice accessible to the community. So I think that's, for me, that's the real value of the recap guide.
Thanks, Michael. And I like you drawing that sort of that view on seeing beyond the visible and tangible, and that's so important. It sort of feels like it's an X-ray machine or something like that. I'd like to ask Bhiamie now. Phoebe's spoken about a little bit about how you've collaborated in the production of the resources, and I guess we're really interested in hearing more about telling us a story about both the production, but also the need for improved approaches to supporting First Nations peoples affected by disasters. I think that's one of the things that through the course of the last year, a lot of your published work really lifted the lid on a topic that has really gained very little attention at all over over the time that I've been working in this space. So really interested in your insights on this.
Yeah, thanks, John and Bhiamie, everybody. It's really nice to be with you all. And yeah, thanks for inviting us onto this panel. It's a wonderful guide, and congratulations to the team behind Recap. It's a wonderful resource, and certainly pushes all of this stuff into a really into a new chapter, I see it as. So yeah, thank you for all of your work. So about this question in particular, I guess there's a real need, and certainly there was a real desire for myself to be involved in this work and to progress it because of exactly what you just said, John. It's just such a, prior to a couple of years ago, this was kind of like a sleeping area in academic and kind of practice in disaster preparedness and planning and recovery. The distinct needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were just kind of not accounted for really at all. And that was really producing very really serious kind of and serious and dangerous situations for communities and precarious situations for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to be in for what we know are inevitable disasters to come. And we've seen this really, come to a head during the 2019-20 bushfires, when we see an extraordinary number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people being impacted, entire communities being evacuated, and the despicable treatment of them once they were evacuated as well. But I think that, look, in terms of this work, there's a need to engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people beyond the lens of kind of social or historical justice. And there's three features, I think, that are really important to keep in mind, to bear in mind with this body of work. Firstly, it's that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities have particular features, possess particular features, things like the unique demographic profile of communities that has, the vast majority, more than 50% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are under the age of 23 years old, with the largest cohort being infants and young children. So that has all kinds of consequences for how disaster planning and recovery and support services during a disaster are designed and carried out. But other features as well, things like intergenerational and overcrowded housing, high rates of poverty, high rates of chronic health issues. And so people really don't have the same ability and the same ability to evacuate and same ability to respond to disasters and recover from them than other parts of the community, because the underlying kind of assumptions around people's mobility and ability to gain work and financial stability and housing arrangements, all of that stuff is really kind of upended, and the bottom's taken out of it in a lot of these situations. So having that knowledge in planning is vital. Secondly, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people possess unique rights that are quite different to non-Indigenous Australians. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have a significant extent of land, of inalienable land. The Aboriginal and Indigenous estate in Australia is very large and continuing to grow. And that includes in southern areas of Australia. It's not just isolated to northern and central Australia, but southern areas of Australia as well. And even things like co-managed national parks, like these things are all kind of overlay Indigenous set of, a unique set of Indigenous rights over lands that are really prone to disasters. So there's a significant extent of Indigenous lands, but also there's an even larger extent of Indigenous cultural and heritage rights as well. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have rights, inalienable rights to access, to enjoy, and to protect their cultural heritage. And so that also requires really careful and methodical planning and considered planning and responses to disasters as well. And then finally, I think the final thing that isn't acknowledged enough, but is certainly really important, is that we don't continue to just simply pathologise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as just vulnerable. Whilst it is true that particular vulnerabilities exist, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are incredibly resilient communities. I mean, how else could it be that we're still here, and that we still continue to exist as distinct groups of people with customs, with culture, with language, with our social and kin networks. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, like many other Indigenous peoples all around the world, including our brothers and sisters across the ditch, are incredibly resilient people. And it's understanding those resilient traits, embedding them in planning and preparedness as well, and responding to disasters. So I think the Indigenous specific recap guide, which the whole team contributed on, but was led by Phoebe, it really starts to identify these issues of planning and preparation. So I hope that responds to the question somewhat, John.
Fabulous, thanks, Bhiamie. And I think drawing out both justice lens, but also the practicality lens, really important for us to sort of recognise that there's sort of two elements here that we should be really considering, and hopefully this is what we've sort of been looking at through the guide. I'm going to turn to Kirsten now. We've already had a couple of people very interested in how the guide could be used in COVID, because we're still currently dealing with a major pandemic. So you used it in your work in Maroondah City Council. So we'd be really interested in hearing you tell us about how you used it.
Thanks, John, and thanks everyone for having me today. I suppose I just want to preface our experiences. You know, we're always willing to learn, and I feel by no stretch of the imagination have we got this right or perfect, but I feel you know, we've tried really hard to encapsulate kind of what's happening in a COVID in our COVID world. So I suppose at the time that when, you know, we're talking March 2020 and mid last year, kind of the pandemic was throwing everything I knew about recovery and emergency management structures sort of out the window. But really around the principles of recovery starts as soon as a disaster starts, and we took that on board. We really tried to use the disaster recovery principles, and I think John might have passed on the work with Recap, and I think it was just a really good opportunity to reflect on what we were doing and give us another perspective on how we could encapsulate the community impacts and strength of COVID, and at that time going into lockdown in Melbourne. 18 months down the track, and we're still, you know, we're still in the same situation. And I think one of the things I've learned in terms of using the recovery capitals is that we actually almost have a COVID response and recovery plan, and the priorities that we've you know, that we've used, both the evidence, the community feedback that we've had around the particular strengths and needs and supports, and then also what we need to do, you know, when we say what we need to do now, what we need to do now to prevent like further consequences into the future. And so I think one of the things that was happening, so the guidelines were being developed as we started to put them into practice, and at the time was you know, passing on this feedback. And COVID really took away that, I think what we're really used to, Michael mentioned it before, but the physical footprint. You know, you can see a bushfire and a flood and the impacts of that, and COVID, you know, we were kind of working with this unseen germ and unseen impact on our community. So I think, you know, it was, I've been through a few disasters, so I've come from a, you know, a bit more of an experienced position. I found the guidelines and the explanations around the capitals a really good base to work with other departments and service areas across the council around how their area of influence, you know, what they do in their normal business impacts COVID recovery. So that was really good. I think, yeah, that's showing that interaction between all of the capitals and how they impact each other, and I think how they can change over time. Was really useful for us in terms of trying to consolidate those recovery priorities. And I think that, yeah, I think it was, you know, we had these conversations. While it's a guideline, and so it allowed for us to interpret it in a way that we needed for our community. And, you know, I had this conversation with Phoebe at the time around the human capital, and I took that interpretation as when individuals, you know, have the information, have the support services, how, you know, the information about COVID, they're up to date, then they can take that next step and participate into the social connection and those other capital areas. And that works for us, you know, in terms of how we put that recovery plan together. So yeah, I think, you know, I think we found that COVID has impacted the whole council, you know, across business support, across our emergency relief network, across our mental health and wellbeing, across capital works, everybody in their 5Ks suddenly using all of our parks and gardens, and really, you know, we reflected that the comments, the considerations around the natural environment in the capital works is really about nature being destroyed. But we were saying it's actually about your, you know, an opportunity to benefit your mental health and wellbeing in terms of having that natural environment. And people in Maroondah used our natural environment to help them with that when we were in lockdown. And so it was just, you know, a slight adaptation of what we normally think in recovery environments and putting that into the COVID perspective. So hopefully that's kind of answered your question. that's 18 months of work in the space of a minute and a half. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny how you can kind of bring it all together. And I guess, thanks, Kirsten. Phoebe, like, how useful was it actually having like access to sort of like a bit of a live experiment, I suppose?
Yeah, absolutely. It was so, it was invaluable, because what ended up happening was that when the Black Summer bushfires were happening and then COVID was ramping up and there had been a series of other disasters, we had actually not been planning on necessarily releasing a pilot version of the recap guide as early as we did, but we sort of rushed that out because what we were hearing from practitioners and through our networks was that it would be useful for people to have something to draw on that we've been working on, even if it wasn't, you know, the final version. And that had this huge benefit as well of, you know, the piloting process meant that we could get feedback from things like what Kirsten's just explained. And in terms of COVID, when I had been gathering together all of this evidence, you know, COVID hadn't happened yet. And so definitely the focus had mostly been on natural hazards. As throughout the piloting process, more academic evidence was coming out, but also it was so valuable to have Kirsten's insights from how, you know, how it was being adapted, needing to be adapted to be relevant to that context. So that was just one of the ways that the piloting process really helped. There were also, we got some really important feedback regarding disability inclusiveness and incorporating more of those considerations into the guide. And then very much the adaptations that we made in terms of the artwork, the visual design of the Australian edition of the guide was informed by that piloting process. So we had already been working with Bhiamie and had been embedding a lot of, you know, the work that he'd been leading in terms of the content of the recap guide, but we didn't have that sort of the visual indicator for people that this was a resource that sort of does consider those things. And so we were then able to engage with Frances Bell Parker and incorporate some artwork from her, responding to the recap framework, as well as the existing artwork that we have from Oslo Davis. So yeah, very much that piloting process and the feedback from practitioners and other academics really elevated the resources a lot.
That's great. Thanks for that. We've got a couple of other questions, but we've also had a few sort of questions starting to come through, which is wonderful. And some of them actually link with some of our further questions, so we might just roll them all in together. I'm going to pose this question, which is, so we've been talking about recovery and seeing them as recovery capitals, but I suppose a couple of people have asked, you know, can these resources be used to inform work sort of in disaster resilience or disaster risk reduction? And Emily, I might sort of pose that to you first up, because I know that you posted in the chat some work that you were involved in terms of planning. So maybe if you want to have a go at that first, and then others if they have thoughts to kick in as well.
Yeah, thanks, John. I guess a key piece of recovery is that of a disaster, that all of those phases of a disaster aren't start, the next one starts. They all kind of roll into each other. And I think that was the importance of building a holistic lens into this guide, particularly that's congruent with an Indigenous worldview, which is holistic by default, and all facets of those phases are interwoven, and in addition to the capitals. Some work that we did in relation to pre-event recovery planning was built into kind of early phases of recap, and working with our Civil Defence Agency in Wellington to host a series of workshops using the capital framework to build in different people from different sectors, and kind of asking them the same sorts of questions, but also looking at other ways that they could engage with the other sectors in terms of forming connections prior to the event, so that when we were in a recovery phase, you know, those kind of networks or telephone networks already existed. And I think that's where the questions or the considerations that we've kind of built into the guide are important to pre-event recovery. If you've done all sort of that background work and thought about those things before the event, you can have better outcomes most likely during the response and recovery phases.
Yeah, great. And I guess this sort of links to a question that Mel Taylor's posed as well, which is really really about, like, you know, if we understand what community values, which is what we should be looking at, you know, ahead of time, yeah, and pose this broadly to everyone. Do these resources help us understand what we should be asking for, what we should be, you know, so how we should be targeting our conversations in communities? Kirsten.
I mean, I think from a local government perspective, and that's just one perspective, but we, you know, we did some work on how the recovery capitals aligned with our sort of 2040 vision. You know, a lot of councils or organisations have these future planning kind of community visions and that sort of stuff. And so really did some work around, you know, if we thought that we were kind of heading this way, COVID's kind of made us take this detour. So how do we get back to what those original, you know, kind of community vision was, and whether that's changed since COVID? And I think that the capitals like really aligned to sort of that future planning. I think there's real, yeah, definitely a real opportunity around, okay, what have we learned from this experience? I'm only talking about COVID at this time because that's what we've done. What have we learned from that, and what do we need to then like improve into the future, and then how that aligns with already what the community vision, you know, how do we get that back on track? And I think it will fit perfectly over, you know, the next 12 or 18 months around how we can do that.
Bhiamie.
Yeah, sorry, just before Phoebe. Yeah, John, just I think the real opportunity in something like this guide, but in particular just this you know, this body of work is, you know, the fundamental like recasting of the whole cycle of planning and of disaster recovery. I mean, generally it goes in like, you know, the ideal model would be, you know, planning, preparation, you know, disaster hits, and then you go into recovery and reflection, and then it kind of starts again. But with climate change increasing, and with, you know, unfolding against the last 2 years of a global pandemic, like it, you know, that model isn't practical really anymore. It certainly hasn't been for the last couple of years, and it's quite likely that, you know, the way people think about those cycles needs to change, and that we will continue to exist in a place, in a world that experiences, you know, ongoing and cascading disasters. I mean, at one point last year, like here in New South Wales, where I live, at one point in last year, you'd phone up the Services New South Wales, you know, to ask about whatever you were calling them about. And on their menu, they'd have, you know, press 1 for COVID pandemic, press 2 for bushfire recovery, press 3 for the floods, press 4 for the mouse plague. You know, I mean, this is our reality. Like, this is what we live through now. And so, looking at the utility of this, or I see the utility of guides, the recap guide in particular, as, you know, really new, really fresh, and really invigorating look and understanding of a lot of these issues. As, you know, disaster planning is one way to look at it. I just see it as community building. I mean, if you have communities that are resilient, communities that are well connected socially, that have integrated and diverse economies, that have multi-use land tenure regimes, and really well looked after natural environments, a sustainable built environment, you know, sustainable, like they're healthy communities. And so we're developing healthy landscapes and healthy communities, and, you know, who wouldn't want to live in places like that? And so I think it needs to be kind of seen as community building and ongoing resilience as well.
Yeah, so true. Phoebe. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Bhiamie, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head there. I think I was thinking on similar lines in terms of, you know, multiple cascading disasters, all of these, you know, these delineations between phases, just they're not even useful anymore in many ways. And that's very much what we were finding as we were sort of putting together the guide, you know, we would have these conversations about how much we were going to try to restrain it to a focus on recovery, and we took a very loose approach because it just didn't seem useful to do that. And I think also the other thing that really blurs things even more and just sort of directs us towards taking that much more sort of community building generally approach is by focusing on equity as well. So it's not just that you have these multiple cascading disasters, but that you have disasters occurring in a context of pre-existing inequities and trauma that may be unrelated to to natural hazards. And so, yeah, very much support that that idea of looking at it sort of without being fixed on a sort of recovery framing, and very much with the conversations that I've had with various people who are interested in using either the recap resources or the framework, the approach. Just as many of them have been in sort of pre-event contexts as well as recovery contexts. So I think that's definitely how people seem to be engaging with that.
Great, thanks, Phoebe. So we've only probably got time for one more question, and I think a couple of questions that have been posed by Scott and Mel, I think we covered off in the Brescia in terms of the broad scale applicability of these resources. So moving away from this kind of idea of being focused on one particular hazard or disaster, can be applied across pandemic, could be animal disease and the like. So that's again, I think the intention of it. A quick final question, perhaps to all of you. The importance of evidence-informed guidelines. Tell me about it in sort of 2 sentences or less. Ron.
Look, in terms of the criticality of having evidence-informed guidelines, particularly for communities or people who might be new to the recovery space, having an appreciation for community members or people who are sort of thrown into a recovery role is that they may not have this sort of experience of leading or informing a recovery process for a community, and they may have no frame of reference for where do you start. So really having a resource like Recovery Capitals, which is informed by evidence, helps to really target and frame how you might approach what is a really complex and dynamic process. So that's my 2 sentences.
Michael, quickly.
So I guess for me is when we talk about recovery with the community or anyone, they get to the point of understanding when they can make sense of the situation, because so much has changed so quickly. They've been put into a set of circumstances they can't make sense of. So giving people some point of reference or some framework, and it's different things for different people. So if we can give people easy access to a bunch of tools or a bunch of learnings or some evidence that actually helps them make sense of their journey. And quite often when you speak to people who have been impacted by disaster, there's a story, and then they'll tell you the story, and there's a beginning and there's a middle and there's an end, and they've gone through this sense-making approach, and for each person it's slightly different. But I think if we can give people, the framework, the language, even just to express themselves and say, well, I was here and now I'm here. And that relates to something I read or something I saw or a visual. And so I think if we're giving people this language and these tools, we're actually empowering them to participate in their own recovery.
Fantastic. I would like to be able to continue this conversation on all afternoon, because I'm sure we could all talk about this ad infinitum, but I know we all have other places to be. So I guess ask you all to sort of put your hands together virtually for our panel, who've come together sort of across, certainly across the large part of the Southern Hemisphere. And I hope you found that was of use. We're always keen to sort of hear more about it. But the great thing that we're also really excited about is that this project is also a finalist in the Resilient Australia National Mental Health and Wellbeing Award. So the winners of all the categories will be announced next week, Wednesday the 8th of December at 12:15. So if you want to get a bit more recap, come along and sort of see whether this great project actually wins an award. So anyway, thank you everyone for coming along. Here's the contact details for both Phoebe, Emily, and myself as a sort of a lead-in user. Feel free to contact us for any further information, or just to have a chat about it, or how you might want to use them. On behalf of Recap and Ada, really would love to thank you all for joining us today. I want to really thank the Ada team for putting together this event. A whole lot of stuff has gone on behind the scenes, and couldn't have done it without them. So brilliant work. It's been a pleasure to host you this afternoon. And until next time, stay safe and farewell.